Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Chitheads podcast. My guest today is Jill Purce. Jill is recognized internationally as the pioneer of both the sound and the ancestral healing movements. In the 1970s, she introduced the teaching of overtone chanting throughout the world and the spiritual potential of the voice for healing and meditation. In the early 70s, she lived and worked with German composer Karl-Heinz Stockhausen, exploring the spiritual dimension of music. She learned overtone chanting in the Himalayas with the chant master of the Gyuto Tibetan monastery. Jill practiced Dzogchen since 1978 with Namkhai Norbu Rinpoche. In the last 40 years, she pioneered her workshops, Healing Voice and Healing the Family and Ancestors, the latter a unique combination of family constellations, chant, and ceremony. Author of The Mystic Spiral, Journey of the Soul, her recordings include overtone chanting, meditations, and the healing voice. She lives in London with her husband, Rupert Sheldrake, who is also a guest on the podcast, and their two sons, musician Cosmo and ecologist Merlin. So with that, hello, Jill. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Hello.
So it's a real pleasure to have the opportunity to chat with you, especially having had a recent conversation, delightful conversation with Rupert, and so he so generously recommended you as well. So I'm very excited to talk to you today about some of the work that you've done around sound and a number of other things. But before we get into all of that, I'd love to hear a little bit about your own story and what led you to the work that you now do.
Well, it's a long story, really. My mother was a concert pianist and my father was a surgeon. So I think that healing and sound were bred on the bone or bred in the bone from a very early stage. And then as a child, I was very influenced by the movement of water. And as I remember one particular instance standing in Oxford, I was at a boarding school in Oxford, and watching the flows of water being resisted at a weir. And I realized that when you interrupt the flow of water, you have these independent eddies, which become like physical entities. So I became very interested in flow patterns and spirals in particular. And then later on, I took the spiral as a question of the universe. I realized that just by looking at the spiral as a record of growth in time, of movement and growth in time, that this made sense of so many different areas of investigation which normally were considered separate. And it meant that it was a kind of integrative process where you could understand everything in relation to everything else.
So the kind of image or the symbol of the spiral was a way of sort of moving past this kind of paradigm of looking at the world that is splicing things up and splitting things off, that you might say is sort of characteristic of the Western kind of materialist model. Is that part of the inspiration behind your relationship with spirals in that way?
Yes, I mean, I realized that you couldn't any longer look at the world in a compartmentalized way. You had to see it as a continuum. And I was very interested in the spiritual path. And so in almost all traditions, the spiral represents the journey of the soul. So the gradual understanding of the self rotating around the central axis, which is what you aspire to, which is the still point, which is the present moment, which is the now, but always rotating around it in a process of gradual development. And so I wrote the book, The Mystic Spiral, which was this mystical aspect of this, and using illustrations from the art of all different cultures, showing this as a psychological process. And this was always a kind of excerpt from a much larger vision of the spiral in nature, spiral in literature, spiral in art, spiral in consciousness. So it seemed to be the perfect way of understanding the world. And but the only one that I published was The Mystic Spiral, which came out in 1973, 1974. I wrote it in 73 and it came out in 1974, and amazingly, it's still in print.
Amazing. So if you could say, this is sort of coming to me as you're describing this, if there was a symbol that sort of was dominating the kind of our current kind of cultural imagination, as opposed to something like the spiral and what it can offer in terms of, highlighting this inner journey. What would you say that is? Does that make sense, what I'm asking?
Well, I mean, I think that is the spiral. Are you saying other than the spiral? I mean, I think that's what the spiral is, really. It has no beginning and it has no end.
Right, right. So you have done a lot of work, especially in more recently in sound healing and doing these workshops in overtone chanting. And so I'm curious, what sort of was the transition for you from this specifically work on the spiral to the work in sound?
Well, I realized, actually, what was really about form, I became very interested in how form comes into being. And so the spiral was one example of that, through these flow forms, through the resistance to flow, bringing about independent eddies. So an example of form coming into being through kind of hydrodynamics in a way. And then the other aspect of form coming into being was in the work of people like Hans Jenny kinematics or Faraday waves, which are or Cleardny patterns, which are these patterns that come into being in formless, seamless substances when you add sound and vibration. And then what you see are these very complex patterns of order coming into seamless, formless substances. And so that was what started me working with sound. It was seeing the forms being created by sound itself. Because what you see, for example, if you sprinkle powder onto a metal plate and then you take a violin bow and you vibrate it, again, what you see is all the powder goes into the part of the plate that's not being vibrated. So the pattern of vibration. So it was seeing these patterns in matter brought about by sound that made me realize the importance of sound. So in both cases, it was how does form come into being, which I realized was an unanswered question, and it's still an unanswered question.
It is, yeah.
And so that's what led me to sound. And then gradually, as I began to work with sound, I realized that in the West, we had gone silent, that all the ways that we had in community and church, in our religious activities, societal activities, all the ways that traditionally we had sung together, chanted together, made sounds together, had been eroded from our lives, and that we had actually gone silent as a community. And also through the development of musical notation, music was hijacked by the professionals, very early on, so that you had to read music if you were going to, and interestingly, the word is execute somebody else's music. And
yeah.
So I realized that all the ways that we had of becoming a community through chant had been eroded. And so what I wanted to do was reintroduce a way of chanting and singing together without having to sign up to some kind of spiritual path. So having spent many, many years studying in many spiritual paths, what I did was find the commonality. What were these principles behind using the voice as a meditative tool that I could then teach people to use, even if they were disaffected from being Jewish or Christian or Sufi or Muslim, but just wanted to find, I suppose, what now is called spirituality without religion. How could they develop their awareness through reclaiming their own voices and thus creating community.
Yeah. Jill, what you're saying is really fascinating, and I think it's one of the things that I've really enjoyed most about getting to know your work is, and I don't think ever read or seen someone kind of put it this way in or draw attention to the way in which we as a culture have lost our relationship to sound. And so I'm curious, just to take a step back, what are the factors do you think that have contributed? I mean, obviously, moving away from traditional kind of spiritual practices is perhaps one of them, but do you see any other kind of cultural forces playing a part in this loss of our kind of intuitive connection to vibration or sound?
Well, I think one is the one I was just referring to, which is this development of musical literacy, where you write down the music that that comes to you, or somebody else's music, and then that is a language which is then only accessible to those people who read music, and that's always been limited. What it gives you is the ability to reinterpret and carry on something which was written a long time ago. So it's and also to put together very complex sonorous events with many permutations and combinations of sound, of timing, of rhythm, of pitch, of melody, of beginning and end, and all the sort of parameters of sound can be remembered, recalled, and then reproduced. So it gives us an ability to do something that we never had without it. But at the same time, it then becomes only available to those people, in a sense, professionals. Yeah. So really, music was hijacked in a way by the professionals. And one of the things about the opposite of a professional, is being an amateur. And the word amateur means to love something. So by definition, there's a sense that if you are an amateur, you love it, and if you're a professional, well, maybe you don't. So yeah. I think that led people to being disaffected, but also I think the idea of recording sound. So I strangely and ironically, so before people recorded sound, in certainly in Europe, people had pianos and they stood around. Well, after pianos were invented, of course, they sang together. They sang around the piano and so on. But as soon as you had recording sound, you get professionals who put the sound into the machine, and then you, as a passive listener, are the one who listens to it and feels that they are somehow inferior. And so also there's a sense in which by putting earphones on, you can ram sound back inside you where it should have been all along and go deaf in the process. I think, this being hijacked by the professionals, has quite a big, line in terms of not just musical literacy, but also in terms of recorded music. So if there are people out there who record music, then people who don't record music become the passive listeners, and gradually their confidence is eroded and they feel that they're not good enough. But also there's what I mentioned before, all the spiritual activities, all the societal and spiritual activities where people have always come together as a spiritual practice in almost all traditions. And these, again, have been whittled away out of our society as people no longer go to take part in these things. So one way or another, that's happened. But actually, since I started this work, it's come back. And one of the things that I've watched since I started, and which didn't exist when I started, are community choirs. So when I started, if you wanted to join a choir, you had to read music, you had to have an audition, you had to sing in tune. And then you had to feel pretty good about your ability to sing. But now it's absolutely wonderful. There are community choirs cropping up everywhere. And that is something really that's come about since I started, and it's just wonderful. And also online choirs, which is very bizarre.
Online choirs?
Yeah, there are
wow.
people who set up with people all over the world singing together and recording. Yeah.
Yeah. Wow. Yeah. I mean, what you're saying really resonates with me, because when I just talk with people about, the way in which kind of sound, or the fundamental importance of sound in our lives, and particularly in the various Eastern traditions, which we'll talk about in a moment. We all sort of intuitively sense that sound is important, because we all have had the experience of listening to a sound or listening to a song and being moved, or having a favorite artist that can really kind of capture our emotion. But it seems like, and a little bit aligned with what you're saying, that by externalizing sound as a form of entertainment, we've sort of lost the kind of connection to its centrality, or just how kind of fundamental it is. Does that seem kind of true to you?
And I think it's not just in sound; it's in everything. It's in medicine, it's in healing. We think that people outside us in white coats know better than we do, and we've kind of relinquished all our responsibilities for everything to people who we think are in charge and who know what's happening, and who are actually in control. But what we're beginning to realize is that no one has the faintest idea what's happening. So all these people that we've given, over our responsibility to, no longer know what's happening. And so in a way, what's happened in the last few years is people have been reclaiming. It's a kind of reclamation. People are reclaiming their responsibility for their own health. They're reclaiming their voices. They're reclaiming everything. People are realizing that there's no one out there. If we can't do it, if they can't do it, we have to do it. And that's happening all over in every sphere, really. And it's about time.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, and also, there's a particular thinker, maybe you're familiar with him. Well, not a thinker, he's a scientist named Stephen Porges, who's also done this really fascinating work about the way in which contemplative practices, tone the vagal nerve in a variety of ways. And so even in the kind of scientific literature, which in some sense has been kind of an obstacle to this sort of intuitive knowledge, even now there's, this seeming sort of at least scientific justification or rationale or explanation for why things like chanting and meditation and these other rituals are really so important. So I'm curious what you think.
One of the things that happens actually is when you're chanting, and particularly, and we'll talk about this later, the overtone chanting, what's happening, and this relates to what you're saying, is there's an induction of order into the system. We're a vibratory system, and the more chaotic our emotions are, the more chaotic we are, the more disturbed are our vibrations. So when you do any kind of meditation, or particularly one involving chant, where you're actually using vibrations, then there is this induction of order into the system. And that's, what's needed in order for these kind of things to be developed, including our inner ability, our memory, our mind becoming more active and more alert, and all of these things become activated and sharpened by this induction of order.
So I hear you saying that, obviously a symptom of not having these practices would be some kind of disorder. But in your experience, are there kind of specific sort of psychological, physiological symptoms that you see as being, I'm sure they all are, but ones that are more obviously connected to a lack of this kind of contemplative work?
Well, yes, I think anxiety is the main one, because we live our lives being regretting what we forgot to do yesterday, and therefore dreading what we have to do tomorrow. And this cycle of regrets and dreads becomes all-encompassing, and until we are never in the present moment. We're always dreading what might happen tomorrow because of our failure of yesterday. So we're in this timeline which has no reality, whereas the only reality is the present moment. And so one of the things that sound enables us to do is to become completely in the present moment. And in the present moment, you can't be anxious about what might happen tomorrow. Mm-hmm. You can only be in the state of blissfulness in the present. And this is the core of every spiritual practice, is how one way or another to be in the present moment, to be here and to be now. And sound does this, and the voice particularly, because if you're making a sound, and then the key to that is that it's more important to listen to the sound you're making than to make the sound you're listening to. So if while you're making a sound, which clearly you can only do in the present, so you can only chant in the present. So if you're making a sound in the present and you're listening in the present to the sound that you're making in the present, then there's nothing of your mental agitation free to roam around in a state of anxiety of what might happen tomorrow, because you're completely absorbed in this circuit of attention on the present moment. And so for that reason, sound is in a way, being in a meditative state is a difficult thing to do, but doing it through sound in this way makes it almost easy.
Yeah.
It's never easy.
Right. And and just to kind of continue on with what you're saying, it seems like there are many meditation practices that, or forms of meditation where it would be easy to slip into this kind of regret and, future orientation constantly, right? That's often the complaint of people who are meditating, like, I can't stop thinking about the things I have, did yesterday, or the plans I have for tomorrow. Whereas, what you're saying is chanting as a form of meditation it helps you to bypass that in a certain way and get you into what often is described as that meditative state of pure presence. So how can chanting change your life? This was a question that came up on your website, and it's a very direct question. And obviously, we're already talking about it a little bit. But besides reducing anxiety and being more in the present, how can this kind of practice help?
Well, I would question the word besides. I mean, I think that this is completely fundamental. To be in the there is nothing more fundamental than being in the present moment. I mean, the cause of all our anxieties is the fact of anticipating what might happen, because we're very clever at thinking of the worst possible things that could happen and then getting sick, because it's this anxiety about what might happen that makes us sick. So I think actually that this is the single most important thing. And then, of course, there is this induction of order in the system that I was talking about, whereas we are like everything, everything in the world is vibratory. It's the regularity and the periodicities of movement. And, the way of ordering those is by inducting order into that system. And you can feel it. If you stand next to somebody, if you're sort of in a normal state of agitation, and you stand next to somebody who's, let's say they've been in a 3-year retreat, meditating all day, all night, you can feel it. Your whole system sort of vibrates into stillness next to them. We entrain with anything, any vibratory system that we are proximus to, that we're near to. And so you actually go into a state of order in training with them. So I think that in terms of changing your life, and also, this is healing, because most of our sickness comes through anxiety in some form or other. And so it's the anxiety and the disturbance that gets into the weak points in our physical body. So the larger the system of healing, the better, So if you can work with your emotional problems first, and then you gradually get down to the physical ones, then this is completely profound. And so working with sound, you're working with a larger system, inducing order into the system and stillness and presence. And there really is nothing more important, I think.
So as a practice, like as a daily practice, Jill, what would, a chanting, what would the regularity of a chanting practice look like? I mean, how long, very practically, like how long per day, how many, is it every day? Is it morning and afternoon? Is it just once per day? What does that tend to look like?
Well, I mean, it can be anything. I mean, the main thing about doing regular practice is, if you're too, when I give a workshop, for example, and I teach many forms of sort of sonorous yogas, many forms of spiritual practices. And people often ask me, what shall I do on a daily basis? And the thing is that if you are too ambitious, you think, okay, I'm going to do this for an hour a day. So the first day you do it for an hour a day, and then the second day you do it for half an hour, and the third day for a quarter of an hour, and gradually it sort of disappears again. So what's in a way more enduring is to start small and then gradually get longer. Obviously, the more you do it, the better. But you have to be realistic about, the main thing is to incorporate it as a kind of regularity and as a habit into your life, so that it becomes, you don't have to think about it, because then if you do, there's always something you can do instead. You can always go down and have a cup of coffee or answer the mail or emails or, any excuse not to do it. So the main thing is to establish it as a kind of regularity. So first of all, breathing is important. It's important to because we're a wind instrument. So how we breathe, we're a tube with holes in us, and so how we breathe is very, very important. So I teach all kinds of breathing exercises. So lengthening the breath, because the breath is linked to the mind. So if you have a high agitated breath, then your mind will be in a state of agitation. So all yogic techniques involve lengthening the breath, for example, allowing it to become an extended out breath, for example. So long extended out breath, allowing the breath to fill you up again. And so working first with the breath and then gradually bringing sound onto the breath. But always this circuit of attention, always listening. That's the key, really. It's the most important thing, is to listen to the sound that you're making while you're making it. And then there are no cracks out of which your troublesome mind, your monkey mind, can travel in order to make mischief. You know, it's to close all those escape routes for the mind, all those ways that we have of making shopping lists when we don't want to.
Exactly.
Yeah. So, and then of course I teach the overtone chanting, which is of all ways of chanting. In a way, it's the most fundamental, because Western music, and with the popularity of keyboard instruments in the 17th century, there was this problem of tuning, which is that if you get to a point, if you have you go to the tuning system would go from the note to the note 5 notes above it. This is unsurprisingly called a fifth. And so you go from that note 5 notes above that, 5 notes above that, and you keep going. It's called a cycle, another spiral of fifths. But when you get to the point after 12, when you should reach the octave, you don't. You overlap it, and it's called a Pythagorean comma. And so this overlap is the problem, because when you try and tune keyboard instruments, you can't. They're very in tune in one place and they're very out of tune in another. So in the 17th century, this was a huge issue, how to deal with the Pythagorean comma, this overlap of a quarter of a semitone, which made all instruments horrible. And so what happened was a great fudgery. So it's called the well-tempered clavier, the well-tempered piano, the well-tempered scale. So what happened was this quarter of a semitone was rammed back inside the octave, so that all the intervals in the octaves were made out of tune. So there's nothing in the octave anymore which is in tune. So all music in the West is out of tune, including that piano I see behind you. It's probably it's electronic and tuned.
Oh, it's really out of tune, not just in that way.
Yeah. So Western music is out of tune, and of course, in the way that we export everything to all corners of the world, we export our music, we export our tuning system. So when you listen to music in the same way as we were talking earlier, you entrain with whatever you're listening to. So you entrain with music, and you're entraining with music which is out of tune. So there's one way which you can avoid this, and this is by what are called the overtone. So every note has a series of notes which are contained within the note. And when you allow them to be audible, allow them to be heard, then these notes, because they come about through resonance, you're not actually making them, you're allowing them to come to emerge. They are in tune. So this is a way of chanting where you are and can only be in tune. And so what you're doing is you're chanting on a single note, and you're amplifying the harmonics so that you hear them as a high flute-like sound floating above the fundamental. And this way you can be in tune. You can be sound in mind and body. You can be not cracked. You can be not highly strung.
So, you know, is this the same as, I think I have heard this style of chanting before, and is it sometimes sound a little bit like, kind of like a didgeridoo that's coming from the, you know, the mouth? It sort of starts as like a low, like sonorous note, and then all of a sudden you hear these different aspects of it. So that obviously requires a certain technique, right? So how does one make that?
Well, that's what I teach. I mean,
you're actually, like, come to the workshop.
Yeah. It is like learning an instrument. You have to practice. And interesting, didgeridoo players, you know, in Arnhem Land, for example, of the didgeridoo actually do, as well as what they do is they blow freely down a tube, which creates the fundamental, which changes depending on the size of the tube, the length of the tube, the aperture of the tube. And then on top of it, they do all kinds of overtones, very sophisticated ones. So, I mean, I could demonstrate it. I have no idea how it would sound.
Well, we can try it. Let's try it.
Okay. I can't imagine it will work, but we can see.
Yes, it worked.
It worked. Great.
Yeah, amazing, Jill. Yeah, that's exactly. So there's this kind of shaping technique that takes place that allows, even though you're chanting the same note, it sounds like you're chanting multiple notes.
Yeah, exactly.
And sort of moving up and down.
that was a note. But then by changing the shape of the resonant cavity, I'm amplifying the notes that are contained within that one note. So we always think of one note as being one note, but actually every note contains an infinite number of other notes that we don't hear. So what I'm doing is I'm selectively amplifying them so that they become audible, but they have no overtones themselves. So they sound like very clear bell-like sounds. People say it's the music of the spheres. And it's a very amazing sound.
Yeah, it's incredible. So how did you come into contact with this particular practice? I mean, I know you were in the Tibetan tradition. Is that part of the Tibetan tradition, or did you encounter this in another way?
I encountered it in two different ways. I encountered it through the Tibetans. So they have a slightly different way of doing it, which is not what I do. So I worked with the Gyuto monks that you mentioned earlier. So I heard it in the late 60s when this sound became very intriguing in the West. They'd never heard it in the West before. And so the Gyuto monks came to the West and demonstrated it. And then I went and studied with the chant master of the Gyuto monks in the Himalayas. And then the other way that I worked with it was when I was living and working with Karl-Heinz Stockhausen in Germany, because in 1968 he wrote a piece called Stimmung, which means tuning or voice or mood, and which was for 6 singers singing one note, a B flat, but throwing vocal harmonics, allowing the overtones to be heard. So I had it in a way through these traditional techniques, through the lamas who had done it for centuries without really knowing why. And then Stockhausen, who had created music out of nothing. You know, he created music out of sine waves and bits of tape stuck together with sellotape, you know. So he created electronic music, and one of the parameters of music is the harmonic structure. So he then experimented with that vocally. So he created music out of nothing, and so I got it through both the traditional spiritual practice and also through the Western art music tradition in the form of Stockhausen and electronic music. And so I had these two streams, really. Yeah.
Wow. So so let me just go back to what you were saying about the keyboard, because I just want to clarify if I have this right. So that the notes that are contained within that one note that you're chanting in the overtone chanting can't be captured correctly by a keyboard instrument, because the keyboard instrument overshoots the harmonic range. I'm probably expressing that inaccurately, but is that essentially the idea?
Well, so what happens? So it's not just a keyboard, because in music you need to play together with a keyboard. So
Right.
the whole of music was retuned, not just for a keyboard. So if you sing a cappella, if you sing with no accompaniment, or if you play a violin or anything without a fixed bridge, you can do anything you want. But where you have a keyboard where the notes are actually fixed, you know, if you press a key, you know, the dampers come off and certain keys resonate, so you can't modulate the sound. So because all music has to tune with that, the whole of music was retuned. So all the intervals within the octave, even the octaves, are not in tune. So the whole of music was made out of tune. And I call this a sort of Faustian bargain, because all music since Bach has been out of tune. And Bach celebrated this when he wrote the preludes and fugues for the well-tempered clavier. He played in every single key, which you couldn't do before. He showed how now, as a result of this tuning, you could play in every key. So all music since Bach would never have been possible without this retuning. Wow. So it's an incredible sort of bargain, Faustian bargain. You know, we'll make all our music out of tune, and look what we can do with it now. So none of this would have been possible without that. So it's a you know, it's a fudgery, it's a bargain. You know, and there's nothing you can do about it.
Yeah,
you have to live with it.
Yeah, that's so interesting. So I want to kind of shift gears a little bit and ask you a question. You know, we were talking about how chanting can sort of change your life, but of course it's not just about, you know, it's not just an egoic, you know, self-centered thing. There's also a kind of reverberating effect that can take place, and in relation to other people, and perhaps socially, politically. And when you in your website, when I was doing a little bit of reading, I noticed someone asked you a question related to Rupert's theory of morphic resonance, which actually, ironically, I didn't ask about at all during our interview. I realized afterwards, managed to not talk to him about it. So I was just curious, actually, what morphic resonance, what's that?
You're going to ask me about it instead.
I'm going to ask you about it instead. Because I think, especially in relation to the work you do with sound, it seems like there's definitely some alignment there. So what is that morphic resonance, and how does working with sound in this way relate to that theory, essentially?
Well, very interesting, really, because both Rupert and I started with the question, how does form come into being, long before we met each other. That was,
wow.
Both of us, that was our question. So his theory of morphic resonance uses the resonance as a metaphor. So it's not really about sound, it's a metaphor of resonance. But how it comes very strongly into play in my work is through what I call the family and ancestral field. So this is another aspect of my work, which we could talk about.
Yeah, I think this is a good segue. Yeah.
So the work posits a family and ancestral field, which we're part of. And so what is very, very clear now is that descendants of earlier members of the family who are no longer living, who have undergone any kind of trauma, suffer themselves. And this has become known, this is actually the hot subject in the life sciences. It's called epigenetics.
Yeah.
And now this is interesting because one of the things that I did in the early 70s, I did a research fellowship with Maurice Wilkins, who with Watson and Crick got the Nobel Prize for discovering DNA. This is something I did at King's College. And at that time, so it was discovered in the late 50s, I think. I don't remember exactly when he got the Nobel Prize, maybe in the 60s. And so at that time, it was still kind of early days in DNA. And the idea then was that everything was inherited in our DNA. But now, interestingly, the hot subject is epigenetics. So how are things transmitted not in the DNA? And so all the materialistic scientists, so first of all, there's no question that this happened. So it's very clear, for example, that descendants of the people who were caught up in the Holocaust have physical changes, not just emotional and mental changes, but physical changes. And the descendants of people in Finland who were exiled during the war have a much higher degree of mental illness and also chemical changes. The people who were descendants from the famine in Ireland, from the famine in Holland at the end of the war. So all these kind of racial situations, there's a huge evidence now that multiple descendants, multiple generations later are affected by the trauma that happened. And then there's one very famous example of the inheritance of fear in mice, which was done in Atlanta about 5 years ago, where mice were given an electric shock while smelling a completely a normal, innocent flower-like substance called acetone phenone, a sort of almondy, flowery smell. And then they found that not just the children, but the grandchildren of the mice, when smelling this innocent smell, were totally freaked out and fearsome. So they found that the fear was inherited through the smell. So now now with nematode worms, they've found changes going down 15 generations. So this is all something which, in my work, there's no question about this. So as I said, all the material scientists are trying to find what turns the genes on and off, trying to sort of embed it materialistic and so on. But Rupert's theory of morphic resonance makes so much more sense, that these things are somehow laid down in a field. We don't know what fields are. I mean, we didn't know what gravity was, we just knew the effects of gravity. So fields are very mysterious things that the effects of. even though you don't know the workings of them. So what I found in this work is that there's a field of the ancestors, family and ancestors. And so whenever there's any kind of trauma, and the trauma means an interruption. So it means an interruption in what might notionally be thought of as a completion of a cycle of life. In other words, dying young, dead in battle, illness, mental illness, incarceration, dodgy dealing, emigration, abortion, miscarriages, adoption, suicides, murders, anything which interrupts a life. So what that gives rise to is a kind of impulse of unfinished business, which gets passed down the generations. So usually there's somebody in every subsequent generation who either follows almost exactly what happened to the earlier generation without knowing the person existed usually, or in some way being exiled from the family field, or being excluded, or self-excluding, or patterns of suicides going down through families. The same thing happening again and again. But the people to whom this happens are the ones that have the opportunity of healing it.
Mm-hmm. Sorry, 1 second. All right, sorry about that. Continue.
So the interesting thing is that the people who suffer through these inherited traumas are also the ones that have the opportunity of healing it. And so, and usually there's very often somebody in a family who takes on that responsibility. They feel in some very mysterious way responsible for the health of the family. And so they're the ones that usually start by coming and doing the work with me. And then what happens is that extraordinary things happen to other members of the family while they're doing the work. And so sometimes people come back on, say, the second day of a weekend and say, you're not going to believe this, but my mother's been estranged from 5 brothers and sisters for 26 years. They all telephoned while we were working, So really extraordinary things happen to other members. And so then they get intrigued and they start coming. And it affects everybody. It's like the family is a web, a complex web. And when somebody works to acknowledge these interruptions and heal them in different ways, which is really about bringing in the outliers, acknowledging and honoring the abusers, not putting them out to outer darkness, but bringing them back into the field so that everybody has their rightful place. And when you do this, everybody feels good, even if they're not present.
So what kind of, obviously you don't want to give it all away, but what kind of practices or rituals are included in this kind of a process? Is it a lot of sound work, or is there other aspects to it?
So what I do is I work with sound between each person. So I try to work with most people who are in the group. So we have a group of people in a circle, and then I choose the person to work with. But before we work, we make sound of different kinds to amplify the family field, and we do a kind of trance movement which is related traditionally to connecting with the ancestors. So I just wanted to say there's something about the ancestors which is very interesting. In most traditions, ancestors have a job description, and that's to look after, to guide, and keep the living alive. So, but the ancestors themselves have no agency unless the living acknowledge the ancestors. So all they can do is be like annoying, clamorous children trying to trip us up to remind us to get in touch and honor them. So they are often a nuisance until we actually do something to honor them and recognize them. And so as soon as you do that, then that gives them agency. It opens the streams of transmission so they can then become helpful and do their job. So that's very much part of this work, which is acknowledging the ancestors in a way that they can come on board.
Wow.
And then I have people to represent people's family members, who then become sort of autonomous people, not acting. It's not play acting, but they somehow, in some completely mysterious way, become them. I mean, it's quite extraordinary. You know, when you're chosen to represent somebody, it's like you become them and you feel like them and you feel the pain that they had, or, you know, if their elbow hurt, you feel a painful elbow. Or, so it's very mysterious. And then, you know, the whole thing kind of unfolds. Every time it's completely different. And guiding it is a very exciting process because you have to ride the wave of novelty in its moment of revelation. There's no point at which you can say, if this, then that. It's just acting as it's revealed, which is thrilling because you have to completely trust the process. You can't have any system in place. You know, you just have to trust that you're in the flow and doing the right thing. And for some reason I'm able to do that, and it's completely magical.
Wow. That's incredible. I mean, my family definitely needs it. So I'm going to be looking up the workshop for sure. And you know, one of the things that sort of that I love about this kind of way of situating our own trauma is that, you know, it seems like at least in the mainstream kind of discourse, we're always looking for the source of our own stuff within this kind of immediate, you know, self-narrative that started when you were however many years old or when you were born. And oftentimes, you know, even that kind of assumption, right, gives birth to its own kind of problems, whereas being able to situate one's experience in that kind of larger web or field, even that alone, acknowledging that, seems to offer its own kind of, you know, liberating sort of feeling, just to not have to take responsibility in that sort of way, in that egoic way, to something that, you know, is beyond you in the kind of ancestral field that you happen to belong to.
It's tremendously liberating, and it has big implications for adoption, because, you know, people used to think when you adopted a child that you were getting a kind of tabula rasa, you were getting a clean slate, and that what you then did, you know, would affect the child. But then people began to think, well, you know, what happened when the child was in the womb? So that gradually it was pushed back further to include the time, you know, of the person who is carrying the child and the traumas involved with that, for example. Yeah. But even now, you know, the implications of adoption are huge, because you are actually inheriting the entire family field going back generations. And so, yeah, that it has big implications in that respect as well. But yeah, it's very liberating. There's no question about it.
Yeah. Wow. So is this the process that you use in the context of these ceremonies? Is this one that you've developed, you know, yourself according to your own, you know, education and intuition, or is it something that has been informed by more directly from certain lineage streams?
Both. It's both those. So I've been working with so long with sound that you know, my use of sound has come through just years of experience. And then the work with the family field is something that's come down through the Gestalt tradition, through people like Virginia Satir, through play acting, you know, acting out family members. And then this became part of a movement which was made popular by somebody called Bert Hellinger, who's an elderly German ex-priest psychotherapist who popularized it and called it family constellations. And so, who I know very well because he uses Rupert's theory to explain the family field. So we know him well, and he comes to visit when he's here. And he asked me to demonstrate the kind of work I was doing in Germany at a conference in the 90s. So it's a combination of all the sound work that I've ever done, the ceremonial work, because I think working ceremonially is really important for other reasons that we can go into, and this kind of Gestalt tradition, which comes through the Western tradition and through people like, you know, Virginia Satir, Bert Hellinger, and my work and others, but the way I do it is very different, you know, because I think it's very important to embed things in a much bigger spiritual dimension, whereas people like Bert, although is quite extraordinary, but for him it's not a spiritual activity, you know. So for me, we need all the help we can get, and so unless we embed it in something much bigger, you know, we might as well forget.
Yeah, what is, I mean, let's talk more about that. I mean, what's the problem with only keeping it, narrowly constrained to that sort of just psychotherapeutic lens? I mean, what are we losing when we sort of reduce it to that?
Well, we're losing a much bigger understanding. That when you embed something in a spiritual reality, you're embedding it in a much vaster knowing, a kind of field of knowing, which is way beyond anything that we individually can have. But one of the reasons this work is so powerful is because if you compare it with talking therapy, for example, the problem there is that most of our problems are deeply rooted in our unconscious. And if you
Yeah.
undergo any kind of talking therapy, you can only talk on the level of consciousness. There's no way you can get below that. And so this work gets, really drills down deeply into the unconscious and explicates it out into the world in a way that otherwise you can't do. So it's a very, very powerful method for accessing this kind of thing. So not only do you need to do that, but you also, by embedding it in a much bigger sense of knowing, then you're and certainly when I'm guiding it, I do that. I'm tuning into a much bigger reality. There's an ability to really get a bigger picture and have more help and assistance, and we need all the help we can get.
Yeah, absolutely. So you touched on a moment ago about kind of the importance of that ceremony and working in a kind of ceremony setting, as opposed to something like maybe, just your individual, a meditation practice or whatever individual rituals you do. So besides, situating it in a larger spiritual context, what else is kind of fundamental, or what is so important about working in a ceremonial way?
Well, one of the things, when you go to do any kind of work, personal work, or any kind of, you start off by thinking that you could be better, you could be kinder, you could be more enlightened, you could be more generous. You want to change. You have a sense that the way you are isn't as good as you would like to be, that you could improve in some way by doing something, right? So that you want to go from here to there. Mm-hmm. So you go somewhere and you do the work, and then you go home, but the people at home don't know that you've changed. So that, it's like a jigsaw puzzle. They resonate with you in the way that they always have, and so there's no way you can actually sustain the new you, because you're going back into the kind of resonant context that you came out of, which knew how you were before you started. Whereas if you work ceremonially, you have people around you who witness you going from here to there, who are present, who know, and you know that they know that you know that they know that there's no going back. So you have this kind of resonance containment, which allows for you to be established in the new. Because if you make any changes, because they're new, they're difficult to sustain, because you have years of the old way of being, which is got a much stronger field. So any kind of introduction into some new needs nourishing and containing and supporting. And that's why, I always think about weddings with this, traditional weddings. In fact, there is, So a lot of people nowadays, they have destination weddings. So they go off to Mexico, they get married underwater with a couple of friends who can afford to go, and they come back and they tell their friends, we're married, and their friends say, oh yes, well, really, but they weren't invited. So again, that's another thing. Not being invited is another thing. But in a traditional wedding, you invite all your societal context, who then witnesses you going from being unmarried, which we thought you might have been always before, to being the new you, which is married. And so that means that your entire societal context knows that you are now married and contains that. And I once, one of my students found this wonderful paper, which is they were trying to find the correlations between what made for longevity in marriage. So they got all the parameters, the size of the cake, the expense of, the wedding, the situation, how long the couple had known each other, did the parents know each other, and every kind of parameter you could think of. And the in terms of correlation, the only thing that made any difference in relation to the longevity of the marriage was how many people were invited to the wedding. Not how much was spent on food, but how many people witnessed you going from being unmarried to being married. So the important thing there was the witnessing. So with ceremony, it's all about the witness, you know, the witnessing you going from here to there, witnessing you undergoing any kind of change.
Wow. So this has been an amazing conversation, and it's been totally delightful talking to you about your very interesting and important work. And I feel like there's one area that we haven't touched on so much, which is the mandala ceremonies, which is another offering that you have, which are these week-long ceremonies. So how do these differ, or how do they complement, or the other work that you do in terms of the sound workshops and what we were talking about, the family constellation and ancestry ceremonies?
Well, I think interestingly, they bring everything I've ever done together, really, because they're very visual as well. It's a completely immersive process, and it lasts 5 days of a week. So I spent, you know, years studying Tibetan Buddhism, and one of the very, very core parts of Tibetan Buddhism is this notion of the mandala, which is a diagram of consciousness. And you know, it has 5 colors, 5 directions, something in the middle, maybe some kind of aspect of divinity that you identify with, and it's got, you know, 4 doors. And so and it's a diagram that you contemplate. So what I in the early 2000s, about 2003, I had this revelation. I realized that it was a ground plan of the stupa. So in Buddhism, the statue of the Buddha is a very late invention, and he comes about when the Buddhists met the Greeks in Afghanistan, which is why he looks like a Greek sculpture, which is why he's wearing a toga and sandals. So he's Greek essentially, and he came late. So before the image of the Buddha, there were demarcations of the center. There were pillars, and there were stupas, and there were the wheels and footprints, but that was it. And so the stupa is a demarcation of the center. You know, it's got a big bulbous thing, and then a sort of umbrella-y thing, and 4 directional gates. And what you do when you go to the stupa is you walk around it, you circumambulate it, and again, you're aspiring to the center, which is the still point. And when you go around it, you know, you have these 4 directions which correspond to the north, south, east. They correspond to the directions, and then you have the central direction. So what I realized was, you know, having spent time in Bodhnak in Kathmandu and seeing the ground plan, I realized that the diagram of the mandala is actually a ground plan of the stupa. And so it's a rotational journey, and it's a rotational journey to the center through the directions. And so the mandala is a very complex diagram. It has all kinds of different aspects. There are many, many mandalas, and they often have an aspect of divinity in the center. And it's essentially a spiral journey into the center. And the 4 directions, which have 4 different colors, well, 5 directions, 5 colors, correspond to what are known as the afflictive emotions. The word is klesha, there's no real translation. So if it's thought of as afflictive emotions, that's one translation, which are not deeply embedded in the psyche, but they're patterns of reaction. So for example, in the East, which is blue, which is anger, so each of these afflictive emotions has its flip side, which is the wisdom which you come to when you transform it. So anger, the flip side of anger is mirror-like wisdom. So if you see things as they are in a mirror, there's nothing to react to. You have no hopes, no fears, no disappointments. You don't react with anger because it isn't as you wanted it to be. You see things in a mirror, mirror-like, everything is as it is. So there's no reaction. So each of these directions have these afflictive emotions and their corresponding wisdoms. This is all built into the understanding of the mandala. It's very, very complex. It's a completely extraordinary understanding of the nature of consciousness. And then there's no self in Buddhism. You know, that's the delusion. There are these aggregates or skandhas, which are sort of groups heaps, and so it embodies all these different aspects. So anyway, what I realized was that it was really a journey, and so I wrote the journey of the soul, the spiral journey of the soul, and here it was. So so it involves my whole idea of the journey of the soul, the development through soul. Then I was a painter originally, so colors, all the directional colors, so we become completely immersed in the colors of the direction. And then sound, because it's continuous. We chant continuously. We have a half-hour cycle of practice, which is related to the aspect of enlightenment that we're working with, which we repeat continuously for 5 days. And we go through, so we progress. We start in one place and we end up in that place 5 days later, but everything's different. So there's every half hour, the whole mandala turns, everybody moves on, like it clicks around. And then we have a psychological component where the one that I'm about to work on now at the end of April is related to Green Tara, who's an aspect of enlightenment in Tibetan Buddhism. And so the psychological component is working with our aspirations. What do we want to be? What do we want to have? What do we want in relationships? And what do we want to do in the world? And so we articulate our desires in that. And then we articulate what's stopping us. And so the psychological work is letting go of both our desires for what we want to be or have, and letting go of that which is blocking it. Because if we let go of desire, then, only then can really it be realized. So anyway, it's a very, very intense and very magical. And the thing that's unique about it is the duration, because there is nothing in our society any longer which has this kind of duration where you repeat and repeat and repeat a continuous chant, and it's absolutely extraordinary.
Yeah,
and it's like the I Ching, you have these incredible permutations where you find yourself working opposite another person with a certain kind of, you're reflecting their aspiration or their psychological components, and it's very hard to describe.
Yeah, but it sounds utterly beautiful. And I love your point that you're making about the repetition, because I feel like, it's sort of, our disposition in this culture is sort of like, oh, well, I've done that. Now I'm moving on to the next thing. I've done that and moving on to the next thing. There isn't this sense of like what arises when we repeat a mantra or a chant, or, what takes place in the kind of container of that repetition. So that's really beautiful. So, Jill, this has been so wonderful. I'm wondering if before we close, I'm going to ask you a little bit about things coming up so you can share with the audience. But is there anything else related to your work or the topics we've been exploring today that you'd like to talk about before we call it a day?
Well, I think we've roamed around far and wide. I think that's
yes,
fine.
We have. Awesome. Okay, well, so
I'd
obviously.
like to people to my website, obviously, because there's a lot of information there. And
there is.
So that's healingvoice.com is the website, or my name, but Healing Voice is easier to spell and remember. Healingvoice.com.
Yeah, healingvoice.com. I've been exploring it myself before we had our interview, and it's a wonderful resource. There's lots of articles and information about what's coming up for Jill. But Jill, what are the next? I know you have something very close to where I grew up in. Well, I believe it's British Columbia. Is that correct?
Yes. So I have I think it's the 27th. I just checked the dates. I think it's the 27th of. I just need to check. Let's see. 26th of July to the 31st. I have a workshop on Cortes Island, Hollyhock. It's a 5-day workshop doing healing the family and ancestors.
Wow.
And I have coming up in England on the 26th of April. I have one of these mandala weeks. The Healing Voice Week with the mandala of Green Tara, and that's in Somerset near Glastonbury, which is one of the most magical and sacred parts of Britain. And I still have a few places on that, and it's a beautiful place, and it's a fantastically transformative week. So that's the 26th of April.
So April and July. So anybody who's interested, who's listening, please do check out healingvoice.com and and join Jill for one of those fantastic events. Are there any others coming up that you'd like to mention, Jill?
Well, there's another one in the States. I'm working in Massachusetts. I'm doing on the 4th to the 6th, I'm doing a Healing Voice weekend at Row Camp. And then from the 6th to the 11th, I'm doing Healing Family and Ancestors. So it's a whole week of 2 different aspects of my work. And that's in Western Massachusetts.
Wonderful.
Yeah.
All right. Well, Jill, this has been fantastic. Thank you so much for joining me today and talking to me about your inspiring work. And
I have one other thing.
Yes.
Yes. I have a week of the family work again near Glastonbury in Somerset on the 14th of June. So that's the most amazing of all the Healing Family and Ancestor workshops, which is over the summer solstice.
Wow.
Which we celebrate. And actually on the 26th of April, we also celebrate May Day. So I have a week in October where we celebrate All Saints and All Souls, and we do a Requiem Mass. So I time these week intensives over these important days of equinoxes and solstices, not equinoxes, the cross quarter days and the solstice. So very important, because this is when the veil is drawn back and contact with the ancestors is much, much easier.
Excellent. All right. And all of those are currently on your website. That's correct?
Yes, they are.
Excellent. All right. Well, thank you so much, Jill. It's been such a pleasure.